Bitcoin has risen to nearly $120,000, just a little bit more as it speak? I think several reasons. One, probably the most important, there's a saying about many elephants trying to squeeze through the door. And what is important to understand is Bitcoin has very limited liquidity. There's only 21 million Bitcoins maximum that can be issued, and about 20 million or so have already been issued. Now, that's the supply side. On the demand side, Bitcoin had a somewhat negative reputation, and that's slowly been removed so that many large institutions, financial institutions, investment banks and so on, mutual funds, etc., feel that there is less stigma attached to investing in Bitcoin. So that's one. Demand is rising on the institutional side. Second, it's much easier now for an individual investor to invest in Bitcoin, because formerly you needed to understand, have a digital wallet, private key and a public key, and so forth. But today you can just go to any major company like Fidelity, for instance, that has Bitcoin ETFs, and simply buy some portion of that ETF with whatever dollars you wish to spend as an investment, and that way you automatically get a Bitcoin investment.
And Ravi,
I think the third thing is what are called digital asset treasury companies. These are companies, the best known as MicroStrategy, that began this a long time ago. But these are companies that invest their cash in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. But clearly Bitcoin is the largest, because Bitcoin is about probably 60% or so of all total market cap of cryptocurrencies in the world. And so the demand from digital asset treasury companies is also, I think, one factor. And then lastly, I think it's much easier for people to treat Bitcoin as just another asset. In other words, it used to be that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were a separate category, but now you can say, if I'm interested in making risky investments, then a portion of my total risk side of the portfolio, the portion of my portfolio on which I'm willing to tolerate high risk, can be perhaps invested in cryptocurrencies also. So it's really a kind of accumulation of factors, a coming together of many different factors that I think has driven the rise of Bitcoin.
Right, Ravi, I have a bunch of questions. Let me kind of jump in and get one more at least in there. So what about the White House, its stance on crypto, the way it shaped the industry? Trump gained legions of supporters by saying that he wanted to be the crypto president, and is doing just that.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. That under the previous administration, the SEC was fairly difficult in terms of having fairly high standards and expectations, and the general stance was, we don't trust crypto, show us that we should trust you. So it was very difficult to try to get new crypto innovations approved because of the uncertainty surrounding how the SEC would react. Under the Trump administration, the opposite is happening. The SEC essentially has become very crypto friendly. There have been a number of legislative acts as well as executive orders issued by the president's office. And also, one of the interesting things is the idea that a portion of the national reserves could be invested in Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a few other cryptocurrencies. And so I think the White House, through the SEC, through executive orders, and also legislation, such as the recently passed Genius Act for stablecoins, the Clarity Act, which was approved by the House, but yet has to be approved by the Senate. And then I think there's also the anti-CBDC bill that is being considered. So I think all of this is creating a much more friendly atmosphere for cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, and other similar kinds of investments.
Ravi, let me pick up on some of that legislation, because where does the regulation stand right now? How are policymakers balancing innovation in digital assets with the concerns about consumer protection and financial stability? Is that in line with other countries in terms of managing assets?
Well, in general, when you think about regulations, you can have principles that derive from common law and regulations that are much more, based on civil law countries. So I think there's always going to be a range of differences. There's also the idea of libertarian philosophies underlying Bitcoin. That is, Bitcoin started out as a group of people saying we don't trust governments to run their monetary systems well. Governments tend to inflate and reduce the value of the fiat currencies. So we need something like Bitcoin. So depending upon the country and its ideological stance and the relative regard that it has for free markets versus more regulation, you're going to have a range of regulations.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think that, for example, the European Union passed the MiCA Act about a year and a half ago, and that creates much more careful regulations to try to protect investors and investor privacy and so forth. Whereas the Stablecoin Act, the Genius Act, that was passed in the U.S. recently, makes it clear that stablecoin companies cannot tell consumers that they're protected in any way by the federal government.
Wow.
What it does say is the reserves must be held and reported upon monthly, and they have to be segregated and, of course, subject to audit. And there's a list of currencies that can be, list of assets that can be held as part of the reserves against which stablecoins can be issued.
Okay.